Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for giving up a Friday evening to come and spend some time with artists, curators, interlocutors, to think about 8 years of what I think have been an incredible journey for M+, working with the Hong Kong Arts Development Council on the presentation of the Hong Kong Venice collateral event for the Venice Biennale. It's a very important part of M+'s work. For us, we feel extremely committed to profiling Hong Kong artists, makers, architects' work on the international, in the international space, and we seek opportunities to do just that. And when in 2012 the first collaboration between the Arts Development Council and M+ began with the presentation of Lee Kit, it began, I think, a very interesting chapter of Hong Kong history of art, internationally, and the framing and positioning. And the positioning is on many levels. The first two iterations were curated by in-house M+ curators. And after those first two iterations, the second two, we've looked to expand the curatorial, the curators by working with external curators. And those external curators work very closely with our team. And the dialogue and exchange, I believe, is extremely valuable and important. We learn from each other. And of course, M+ is only 9 years old as an institution, active in the community in different ways. And when I say that and I think about what we have done over that period, I am intensely proud. It is an incredible achievement, and it's an achievement because of all the individuals involved in making that, the artists, the architects, the designers who've also worked together with us, but many more individuals beyond that as well. Now, each Venice exhibition is coupled with a return exhibition. And for us, this is as important as the presentation in Venice. And how that is expressed, it changes fundamentally, but also very interestingly, because location brings a very different perspective and a point of view. And and certainly for M+, we are very alert to what points of view bring to the conversation, and we always think of the work that we do as work in dialogue, because conversations and dialogues are actually the most important form of exchange. I should also acknowledge and thank Hong Kong ADC colleagues, Chris Chan and Sarah Wong. I mean, Chris has made it with his team from Macau just for this evening. Queenie, Hilda, and Kay, they're wonderful that you've made that effort from the working group of the Hong Kong Arts Development Council. It's relationships in the end that make change of any sort happen. We have also invited John Tain, the head of research at the Asia Art Archive, to moderate this evening. Thinking, again, wanting to work together with other Hong Kong arts organizations, cultural organizations, and given the mandate that Asia Art Archive has to preserve and write the history of Hong Kong. And we think we know M+ is a crucial part of those histories as well. So I think when we see the presentations this evening, and think about these last 8 years of artists' work in Venice and Hong Kong, it's an incredible concentration and parallel journeys about Hong Kong as a place and a vibrant, dynamic, and also expanded international city producing artists working critically in the international space. We need to reflect on what that means today, and we can see over that period of 8 years the fault lines, and we're sitting on one right now in Hong Kong, what that fault line is revealing. And I will leave it to artists and curators and John to reflect on that as well as other things this evening. So thank you for coming. And John, over to you.
Thank you, Suhanya, for that eloquent introduction. My name is John Tain. As Suhanya mentioned, I'm head of research at Asia Art Archive, and it's my great privilege to serve as moderator for the event tonight. I want to keep my intro very short, as we have very many wonderful speakers, and so I will just read their introductions in order of presentation. So first of all, we have Yung Ma, who is curator in the Department of Contemporary and Perspective Creation at the Musée National d'Art Moderne, Centre Pompidou in Paris. He was co-curator of the Hong Kong exhibition at La Biennale di Venezia in 2009 and 2013, and he will also organize the Seoul Media City next year. Yay. He will speak tonight, however, about the solo exhibition of Lee Kit for Hong Kong's participation at the Biennale in 2013. Stella Fong, lead curator, learning and interpretation at M+, and co-curator of the solo exhibition of Tsang Qinghua for Hong Kong's participation at the Biennale de Venezia in 2015. Samson Young, artist of Hong Kong's participation at the 57th International Art Exhibition, La Biennale de Venezia in 2017. And Shirley Tse, artist and faculty at Cal Arts, or the California Institute of the Arts, where she's been since 2001. And she is the Robert Fitzpatrick Chair in Art, and she is the artist representing Hong Kong in the current edition of the Biennale in 2019. And the show will be coming here next spring. And also joining her will be Christina Lee, who is an independent curator, writer, and guest curator of the current participation of Hong Kong in Venice. So without further ado, I will welcome Yung Ma to the stage.
Hi, thank you, John, for the introduction. And I have to say, first of all, thank you, M+ for having me here tonight. 多謝各位今晚嚟啊，即係星期五晚，大家嘥時間嚟，多謝你哋。So yeah, thank you all for coming tonight as well. It's actually quite interesting. I was asked to talk about the Lee Kit exhibition because I did quite a lot about that, when it happened. Almost 6 years ago. Well, 6 years ago now, and but we often, because I was curating it together with Lars Niver, the former director of M+, so we would do it together, and also Lee Kit would be at the presentations most of the time as well. So I'm slightly nervous of doing it myself. I hope I'm going to be doing them sort of, or the project justice actually. So this the title of the show at Venice called UU at the time. As Lee Kit, so I'm not sure if I can actually try to explain the title that much, to be quite honest. I think it just kind of came to him one day. I was like, we needed a title, and that came. And the blue has been the signature, well, one of the sort of signature visual languages of Kit's practice. So that was sort of chosen on purpose as well as the visual identity of the exhibition. So I'm just going to sort of go through the process a bit. I think I hope that's sort of interesting for you tonight. These images actually represented Kit's sort of journey to the site. What happened? I think when M+ was invited to collaborate ADC at the time. The site has actually been the Hong Kong, can I say pavilion? I guess Hong Kong pavilion for quite some time already, actually. But the fact is, because I was actually involved with early edition as well, so the funding wasn't quite enough to really renovate the space. But with the combining of sources between M+ and ADC, we were able to actually renovate the space properly. So we actually spent quite a lot of time looking at the site and actually worked with a local architect in Venice to make it into something that would actually, how should I put it? I mean, that would actually be somewhat more decent for contemporary art exhibition. So these photos are basically, the process of renovations, and given the fact that it was Venice, so it took quite a long time for that to be complete. But we actually did a lot of work actually, because the fact that with Venice as well, because the pavilion, the location of it's right next to the canal. So over the years, the building's been sort of damaged by the humidity quite a bit. So we actually had to pretty much ripped everything out and put in everything new, in a way. And also, I mean, that became quite an interesting process for us and for Lee Kit, because for Kit, actually, space has always been so important to him. I would say, I think most of his solo projects have been about the spaces. So by doing this, he was able to actually really think about the space and actually using it almost as a canvas, in the sense that to actually build a foundation for what was to come. So I don't know if you could tell the difference before and after. Well, quite a massive change from my point of view anyway. And we did actually, I think from the get-go, I think both Lars and I, we were quite clear with Kit that, we were there to help him to realize the project. So I think we were not being too intrusive, in the sense that, it's mostly the concept and the direction were mostly driven by Kit. And at least, well, especially I think my role, because my relationship with Kit as well, so I was really there to try to facilitate what he wanted. And these are some of the images in terms of working with Hong Lam, who was the graphic designer that year, to come up with the visual identity, but also all the other printed matters as well, including the catalog. So we spent actually quite a lot of time talking about that and actually working together. And also for Kit, because materiality has always been really important as well. So we would actually spend a lot of time talking about that in terms of what types of materials to use as well. And what was actually quite interesting as well, because I mean, I think with the ADC direction for the Hong Kong Pavilion, so I might be incorrect, I'm not 100% sure, but I think there's always been an internship program. So a lot of younger Hong Kong curators or art students were able to go to Venice because of that. But we actually sort of expanded on that, because before it was mostly so curatorial driven, but that year we decided to do a technical internship as well. And I think that's been sort of ongoing ever since. So I think that's fantastic, actually. And so if you can see, some these were the interns, the technical interns at the time, helping us to do the installation in Venice together. And Kit actually spent, I think, almost 2 months in Venice. Again, I mean, because space is so important to him. So actually, a lot of the installations were actually made on site. And so we were extremely grateful that we had the technical interns there to help us to realize that as well. So just more images of that. And that's Lars in the corner together with Mia Fong as well, who helped us a lot on this project. And this is the facade of the pavilion, which actually we all like. This idea actually is not. I mean, this is not a work. It's actually a concept that came from the designer Hong Lam, and we all really loved it. It was meant to be promotional material, but somehow it sort of worked really well with Lee Kit's concept and ideas. Sadly, actually, because in Venice, regulations can be quite strict, and this actually did not fit into that at all, because we were only given a certain space that we could only have a quite small banner, but we decided to just go for it. And this wasn't up for 2 days, if I remember correctly, actually, during the opening for 2 days, and then it got destroyed. Literally got destroyed by someone at night. We don't know who did that, but luckily we had a smaller version of it, so we can replace it with it, because we knew we had to remove it at some point anyway. That's the courtyard space of the pavilion. I think I'm not going to go into details about Kit's installations here, because I don't think I've got the time for that. So I'm just going to show you the images. I think it's more interesting for us to talk about the processes later, perhaps. So these are the different installation shots of it. As you can tell, Lee Kit's practice quite diverse. So you got installations, but also moving image-based works as well as painting practice. And it's sort of, I mean, he's sort of always been understood as a painter at the same time. So it's sort of, I think it's something that's quite interesting as well. That's the end of my presentation. I just want to mention the fact that I didn't include any photos of the Hong Kong version of the project, which I now, in hindsight, I should have. But I just want to say something that the Hong Kong version was quite different as well, actually, even though we had some of these installations in the Hong Kong version, but because spatial arrangement, we had to rearrange the orders of it. So if you can go online and have a look, actually you could tell that they're quite different as well. So thank you very much. I think my time probably is up anyway, so thank you.
So, so this is the one from 2015. Well, I must say, even though it's just 4 years ago, but it just seems ages. I really need to refresh my memory, you know, what I have done and also written by that time. So I co-curated this exhibition with Dorian Chong, and then the artist is Chang Qinghua. The exhibition title is The Infinite Nothing, and this is the visual identity of the show. As you can see, well, from the first attempt, this is the second attempt for the facade of the pavilion. You can see that because it's, well, so you can see behind the scene of the cloth actually is full of graffitis. It's really challenging. So that's the reason why the designer think about maybe we should build something else in order to, you know, try to have another version of, you know, imagining about the banner outside the pavilion. And from the right-hand side, you can also see the map, the floor plan. When the artist was there for the first visit, he really found the courtyard very challenging for him, feeling like there are 3 spaces, and then on top of that, there will be, you know, there's a courtyard space. So that's the reason why he really want to merge these spaces into one, so making a more like a circular journey for the audience. So that's the reason why at the end, maybe some of you might recall, so he actually built and actually cover the whole courtyard to turn it into like you know, like one, you know, very specific journey. So the title is Infinite Nothing, which is derived from a passage in the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's The Gay Science in 1882. So related to this section where the philosopher actually make the pronouncement of the death of God, which he say, are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? So the whole work actually brings together a host of philosophical concepts expressed through metaphors, allegories, and also alongside with other religious symbols and also popular cultural references. Just because this expression audio is very important, it's a very important element in the whole installation. So that's the reason why I really hope that I can, even though this is presentation, I want to show you part of the whole installation. So this is the courtyard. So because of the time limit, so I'm not going to show you the whole video, but just to give you a sense of how the installation looks like. So for the whole exhibition, it consists of 4 individual video installation. So the first one, under the title, The Infinite Nothing, so it's called Old Strike Through. So he got references from the philosopher talk about the river allegory, thinking that one cannot step into the river twice, meaning that everything will be changed, even though it looks the same. So this is the first gallery in the courtyard, and then the second gallery it's called Eye Strike, with a projection on the blocked arched doorway. So maybe from Young Ma's presentation, you can remember there are actually 3 arched doorway, but then we kind of block all the doorway and then show the middle one, and then we have projection on it as well, with references from Nietzsche's notion of Camel spirit, and also Bela Tar's, the very famous film director's theme called Turin Horse. Of course, we've also mixing with the Plato's cave allegory. What I must say is really hard to explain all these kind of philosophy, religious, symbols, everything. So if you're interested, please visit the website and then, or get a copy from the pavilion, because we have a lot of explanation, and it's almost like a dictionary of the whole exhibition. So the third one is so getting inspiration from the windows for this historical building. So the artist also produced this raining and also stormy like landscape projection on the window, and then you can't really see, but I think if you're getting closer to the wall, you can also see some kind of water leaking on the wall as well. For the last room, which is called O. So it's more like kind of iconic Zhang Jinhua's text protection, and these texts are drawn from like Bible, Nietzsche's philosophies, and also like Eastern ideas like Taoism, Buddhism, and even Stanley Kubrick's movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. So I think it's interesting to highlight that, you know, when we're working with the artist, he keeps saying that his practice is almost like being an editor in general. So the whole video installation is almost like collage painting. So he actually assembled found footages, texts, images from various sources, you know, using his very specific angle to interpret it. So at the end, when you leave this room, actually I will lead you going back to the beginning of the installation, giving a visitors the physical shape to another Nietzsche's theory called the eternal recurrence, meaning that life, you know, the meaning of life is like this. It's almost like a cycle. You go, you know, round and round, but of course every time will be a different trial. So just to give you some, you know, behind the scene images. So we also work with the same design company, Co-Design, and then we also have like visits and also, you know, try to do measurements. And of course, why I must say it's very, well, I'm sure, you know, other curators won't, you know, disagree with me as well. I think it's really complicated, you know, to work in Venice, especially in terms of resources, support. So you can tell that, you know, we are having very ambitious construction. Unbelievably, we finished all the work in 10 days. So everyone's like, wow, this is kind of, you know, amazing, given that we're in Venice. The construction work is so complicated. And of course, I think we're also lucky to have support from agency by that time as well. Just remind me, you know, a really huge hiccup at that time is about the license, because originally when we cover up the whole, because I think the artist really want to turn the daytime into nighttime, so that he wanted to cover the entire, you know, courtyard. But then in terms of, you know, getting licenses from the city council is so challenging, because, you know, at the end we have to change our design kind of the last minute. But still, of course, sometimes, you know, hiccups also, it's also a good thing, because we try to reimagine and actually turn out, you know, like we make, you know, like a twist, you know, to the construction, but then actually make a better interpretation of the whole installation. So these are other installation shots. And of course, I think another challenge is to cover the entire courtyard, and then we have to deal with the heat and also the loading for 10 projectors, and also, you know, to leave, you know, like water, you know, getting, you know, the pipes in as well, and also we have to seal the whole space, so air, you know, air ventilation and all these kind of things count. So again, it's not just about, you know, the work, the design, but also it's also about a lot of, you know, technical things that we have to deal with. So this is another one, you know, we also spend a lot of time doing the edge blending and also cabling work. And luckily, we also have, you know, different supports from technicians there, as well as we also brought interns. Technical interns really play an important role during the installation process. So yeah, we also have, you know, different media coverage. Yeah, that's it for my part. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Samson. Was the artist of the 2017 edition of the show. Ying Kwok was the curator, and of course also Sonia So. So I don't know if Sonia is here tonight, but Ying is here in spirit. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity to sort of talk about the project and in the context of the other projects that had happened. Thank you for the opportunity. The show that I made was titled songs for disaster relief. And actually in the Chinese title, there's a let's say a translation or meaning that was not captured in the English. In Chinese, it's a 赈災專輯, which means that the show was conceived of as a kind of an album as well. So there were 4 songs in this, or 4 different pieces in this album. And the show centers, all of the pieces in the show is centered around the idea of charity singles as a let's say a musical genre in and of itself, and the history of charity singles and what charity single mean for us today, or like the moment when charity single happened or was the most popular, what that means for us today. So what you are seeing right now on the projection screen is an animated figure that was a part of the show, that was in one part of the animation. And this figure, the image came from the album cover of the iconic charity single, Do They Know It's Christmas? So if you remember the album cover, there were 2 characters in the middle of the cover. There was a girl, like there was a drummer, and then there was a boy, blonde hair, boy with blonde hair, that looked like this, and so we modeled the character on the album cover, and that became an element of the show. So there were 4 pieces, and one of the pieces focused specifically on Do They Know It's Christmas, and the other pieces were based on other charity singles, including We Are the World and Bridge Over Troubled Water, which to everybody else, I guess in sort of outside of Hong Kong, people just think of it as Bridge Over Troubled Water. But in Hong Kong, it was in the 90s, it was covered as a charity single in Hong Kong to raise funds for the Eastern China flood. So let's talk about I just want to talk about mostly, spending most of my time talking about the Do They Know It's Christmas piece. So when I was looking into the history of the song, its production, I came across a piece of news about a group of singers from Cape Town who had come together to make a response song to Do They Know It's Christmas, and they called the song Yes We Do, and they tour with the song, with the charity single, and they donated proceeds from that charity single to contraception and sort of reproductive education program in the UK, which I thought was very funny. So I started to look into like these musicians. They had a name. They were called, the group was called Plastic Cast, and the leader of the group was called Bumthang Gadani. So I started asking around, actually asking friends in Cape Town whether they knew these group of people. And then rather quickly after asking around, I figured that this actually did not happen. But I thought it did happen because by the time I picked it up on Red Light Politics, which is a online sort of politics blog, it had been reposted as something that actually did happen. But the origin of that piece of news was on Heibo, which is like an Onion Leaks sort of South African satire news website. But it went around the internet for a couple of times and then got reposted as facts in several online platforms. So one of the pieces in the show imagined that musical character and what he might have done, where he lives, what he likes, what his living environment would be like if. So what we're seeing now is the room that was kind of imagined to be a kind of living room of this imaginary character, Bumthang Gadani. And so this work is called Palazzo Gadani. And so we actually went to, there was a whole backstory, which I'm not going to go into, but we went to Williston in North Dakota in an oil field and shot a music video for this fictional character as well. Here's some more images. And then in the front room, we also made some sort of like pretend platinum records and this pretend statue / trophy type object, which is kind of like a little like Hall of Fame for this imaginary musician who looked like this, sung and played by my long-term collaborator Michael Schneefeld, who's really wonderful. Some more photos of the object. So just want to play you a little video of what that piece looked and sounded like. So that was the first two rooms. And the curtain that was going around the room, it had lyrics of different charity singles sung on it. But that piece served kind of a double function. When you're working, I'm sure all the other curators and artists would feel the same way when artists work in this space, which Hong Kong has been working in for a while now, because you're living, I mean, there are people living on top of it, so you have to consider things like noise level and so the curtain served sort of like a double function. It was a part of the work, but it also helped buffer some of the sound coming out of the room. And the other curator had talked about sort of thinking about the elements, and it's really true that you do think about that sort of thing, that sort of practical consideration a lot in a space like this. I'm just going to spend a little time talking about one other piece, which is the piece in the next room. It's the one that was based on We Are the Well, and I'm sure we all know We Are the Well. And I have a series of pieces called Muted Situations, where if you imagine that you have a remote control and you could mute or try to take away one specific layer of sound, then that's what the muted situation tries to achieve. And so in this muted situation, which is a little unusual from the other ones that I've made before, which usually are sort of more generic descriptions of these situations, I have, in this particular one in Venice, I've coupled up a specific group of performers, which are the members of the chorus of the Federation of Hong Kong Trade Union with We Are the Well, and have them sing the piece in this specific technique. And this is the result of our collaboration. Thank you.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Christina Lee. I'm the guest curator of the current edition of Hong Kong in Venice, and next to me is Shirley Zha, the artist that's representing Hong Kong this year. Since time is very short, we're just gonna kind of rush through a lot of things. But reflecting on the history of the Venice Biennale, the Hong Kong representation, which we've just seen the past 3 years, it was the aim to present and broaden the generational and geographical as well as gender representation of Hong Kong artists in Venice. And it has been my great privilege to work with Hong Kong-bred and trained and LA-based Shirley Zha for this year's Hong Kong presentation, Shirley Zha Stakeholders Hong Kong in Venice. Widely exhibited internationally, Shirley's sculptural practice is devoted to visualizing heterogeneity and differences through sculpture and installation. So over the past 2 decades, Shirley has used sculpture to consider how plastic operates as a signifier of globalization in terms of the material circulation, standardization, and industrialization. So in the first, I think the first decade of her practice, she employed mass-produced ready-made, such as styrofoam packaging, which you see here, and other consumer polymers in her practice to deconstruct the underpinning complexity and conflicts in various industries and histories embedded within their use and manufacture. In her recent investigation, she looks at plastic as an adjective, exploring its resonance, movement, and multiplicity, and carefully considers what individuals can learn from these common materials, processes, and structures that shape a pluralistic world. Yeah, great, thanks. For stakeholder, for the first time, Shirley introduces wood and juxtaposes it with plastic for their slow, indeterminate manufacturing processes that inherently produce difference and negotiation. The 2 new site responsive installations negotiated differences in Play Court, which Shirley will elaborate further. that make up the exhibition embrace sculpture as a form of multi-dimensional thinking where materials, processes, audiences, and space enter into negotiation. This negotiation is key to stakeholders, a space that's proposed by Shirley, for audiences to conjure new narratives as well as to invite reflections on how to coexist amidst differences, which is very relevant now, while reactivating our relationships and renewing our individual stakes in a shared heterogeneous society. So now I would just like to invite Shirley to walk us through the works that are on view right now.
Thank you, Christina, and thanks for being here and the opportunity for me to share this current project with you. And as Christina talked about, I really want to position sculpture as a model of multidimensional thinking. And for this version, I have 2 site-responsive installation. And as you've seen from the previous presentation, there is an indoor space and an outdoor space. And as you see when you walk into the venue, there's this outdoor space, and I focus on the residential quality of the space, because you can see that there's still people living above the venues, and there's clothing lines, and I want to focus on using sculpture that is more focused on verticality. And for the indoor space, since it has like kind of a low-hung ceiling, I want to use sculptural form that focus on horizontality. And as you can see from this floor plan, the indoor space, I have envisioned a sculpture that have components, but it allows for different kind of configuration that can become a sort of rhizomistic structure that spreads through the multiple rooms. And in the courtyard, you can see that I have set up a, from the previous image, I have set up a imagined scenario of a game of badminton where it looks like there's a scenario of someone could be playing street badminton. Because when you play street badminton, you don't really have a net. So you might pick up some makeshift objects. So I imagine using some of these sculpture to place in the center of the courtyard to do a sort of a makeshift net, and then have rackets form sculpture on either side and a bleacher against the wall for audience to use. And you can see the images here. The sculpture is sort of a combination of half equipment and half biomorphic forms that a lot of them are on stands and tripod that has a sort of telescopic quality to them, so that it can extend upward and draw viewers' sight line to the clothing lines. And also, if you notice, there is a antenna, this radio antenna that's part of the sculpture in the middle of the courtyard. And this is actually ham radio antenna, which is amateur radio, and one of them is actually functional, that also has resonance to the residential quality of the space, because when you're in the courtyard, you might hear people's conversation and the washing machines running and so forth. And here's some details of some of the sculpture that has a sort of half equipment, half biomorphic form. And then also you can see details of the rackets. And I think we can move forward to the next one. Yes. Oh, this is the one. And I use the badminton form because it's sort of a combination of both a personal narrative and a collective narrative. And since this is Hong Kong and Venice, I want to emphasize the colonial history of Hong Kong. When I left Hong Kong in 1990, it was still a British colony. And
as I remember, actually I didn't know about badminton until recently, that it's actually a product of a colonial period. It was invented in India by the British when they combined more ancient form of a shuttlecock with the racket, and therefore you have that badminton. And then at the same time, it's also a form of public domain, because when you play street badminton, you're reclaiming the public space. And likewise, the reason why I use the ham radio is another example of reclaiming public domain. Radio is actually formed of people communicate across the globe before the internet time. It's sort of the internet before the internet. And since Second World War, most of these frequencies are actually used by government and corporate. And the band that is left for civilian use is actually very limited. But even till today, there are still numbers of ham operators who reclaim this public space. And now we move on to the indoor part, and the title of this installation is called Negotiated Differences. And as you see from the play card piece, because it's an imagined scenario badminton, you kind of have to negotiate, you know, what kind of game is it? It looks a little bit strange. And the same, likewise, in the interior, I have this installation where you have to use your body and move through the space. And as you walk through the first room, you might realize that there's a sculpture that's sort of blocking the archway, which sort of reroute the viewer's flow. And then you have to back up and go through the courtyard and enter into the space for another room. And this installation is made of carved wood that is carved on a lathe, and a combination of, and then it's put together with 3D printed connectors or joints. And as you move through the space, you can see that it's all one piece. It sort of meander through the different rooms, and you can see that you can walk through the doorway to another, to the back of the piece through the archway. And with the carved wood, I want to really put different kind of differences together. So when I do some research on how what objects are being made, objects are being made on the lathe, I find out that there's a numbers of different kinds. Some of them are, a lot of them are actually furnitures or architecture details, and then some of them musical instruments, as well as domestic objects. So, and as you can see from this example, when I connected all these objects together, you can see that like a baseball bat will turn into a flower rolling pins, and a prosthetic leg to table legs, and so forth. And as you move to the other room, because this is a site responsive piece, I also have carved some object that is pertinent to the site in Venice. As you can see, there's an oar in the middle. And as well as here you can see a picture of how besides, I'm using different kind of wood, there's different species, and also with lathe or wood turning is actually technology that's been used across different cultures. So I'm trying to include this form from different culture here, as well as you can see that there's example of American vernacular furniture, like, you know, the table legs, but then also there are a hand-carved table leg from a Ming Dynasty style in there. So not all of them are turned by lathe, but a small portion of them are hand-carved. And then there is also an example of an abacus, as in an ancient calculator. And here you can see that the details of the piece, which, okay. And when you look at this piece, I want to combine old technology and new technology together. So the lathe is actually an old technology, and the 3D printer is newer. And then also, in terms of sculptural language, the 3D printer is an additive process, and the lathe is a subtractive process. And this is the, I only started playing with this technology from 2015, so it's pretty recent. And in the beginning, I'm doing a lot of experiments, so you can actually see like some of the wood actually is I made some mistake and I include in the installation because I think the learning process is important to me. And I'm really glad that with the commission, I have the opportunity to really further develop this new technology I'm learning, both the carving and the 3D printing, to concentrate on developing this body of work fully. So as in the interest of time, I think I will also show you a few images of how some of the pieces are how do I put it? When there is a wooden object like the gavel on the left, actually is the whole piece is actually a little bit of a visual diary. So in that process, it was about the time when the Democratic Party in the United States went back to House, and I was really excited seeing Nancy Pelosi holding the gavel. So the next thing I know, I want to carve a gavel. So, but the actual gavel, you have to put the two wood together. You have to drill a hole through the wood, but that's not the logic for my installation. So in that sense, I have to visually align them through the connections of the 3D printed connectors. And the same thing happened to this set to the right, which is inspired by Moroccan architecture. And I'm just going to conclude that I want to say something about the title of the show, and it's called Stakeholder because obviously, morphologically speaking, there is a lot of stake form and there's a lot of holder forms, but also philosophically speaking, this exhibition is a continuation of my exploration of the concept of heterogeneity and in particular, how differences enter into negotiation with each other, how all these differences trying to come together and joining the fight in gravity. And stakeholder capture the interdependence of individual entity that has agency. So the concept of agency, connection, negotiation, and public domain, and the non-determined action and play are some of the key concepts for this show. And for the return show, because it's a different site, I'm gonna make some modification to these pieces, which I really look forward to see the next iteration of both play court and negotiated differences. Thank you.
During the presentation, just how incredibly diverse and varied the presentations were. And I know that Suhanya already mentioned in her introduction that this is in some ways very much an accomplishment, the iterations from the last few Venice Biennale. But and also she mentioned something about the process. But Dorian, since you're chief curator and deputy director at M+, and have also been co-curator of both the most recent edition as well as the previous two with Samsung and Stella, I was wondering if you could say a little more about the process of working on the Venice Biennale in general between M+ and Hong Kong and ADC, the working process for that.
To be precise, you're correct that I've been involved in the last 3 editions. I started in 2015. So I was the co-curator with Stella. Although I have to acknowledge Stella did most of the heavy lifting. And then for the next 2 editions, I served as a consulting curator. And Christina's here as the guest exhibition curator for the current edition. And Ian Kwok, who's here in spirit, who was also this guest curator. And really, we have already acknowledged, have to say that this has been a very fruitful collaboration with Arts Development Council, who is, of course, has been the commissioner of the Hong Kong participation in Venice, and for the last 4 editions, co-commissioners, but they really have the institutional and administrative responsibility of for continuity of Hong Kong's presence, which has been there since 2001. So each time it's been a very generous invitation that we've responded in full by bringing as much resources as well as brain power as well as a strategic thinking that we can bring to each edition. And then I guess maybe one thing to quickly add is that it is not it is a very interesting collaborative model. On the one hand, Arts Development Council has given us a full curatorial autonomy. So M+ or guest curators that we have invited have the full autonomy and authority to select the artist and work with it. Then there are details that we can go into later as they see fit, but also it is at the same time a conversation that once the artist is selected, then there is a very clear and fruitful discussion with the Arts Development Council, but also Venice Biennale Working Group, and a couple of representatives are here, and we definitely have to want to and have gone through the conversation.
Okay, great. And I know that part of the process is also thinking about Hong Kong as a place as well for each of the artists and each of the curators. And I know, Samson, you alluded to your project in some ways having a connection with the Bridge Over Troubled Waters and the very specific meaning of that song that it plays in this location. And Shirley, I think you alluded to that as well, in your talk, and the meaning of specific pieces and how they refer to history here. And Christina, I know in your essay you kind of link the pieces and Shirley's upbringing here in Hong Kong. But I was wondering if maybe you could each say a little more about the connections of your work to Hong Kong, because it's not necessarily an explicit allusion, right? It's not like kind of about representations of Hong Kong per se in a kind of direct way. And I guess also more broadly about the politics of place, like how do you feel about representing a place, because whether or not you think of yourselves as representing it, you are in some ways seen as representing it, right? So especially, I guess, Shirley, since you're both, I kind of identify with you as someone who's born in Asia, right, but also, like in the U.S. in some ways, so it's kind of like you're in two places.
Yes, it seems like there's multiple questions in there, so I guess I will try to pick it apart. And in terms of the work, well, since I have a long history of using plastic in my work, and plasticity has been something that has a lot of significance in my process, and I think Christina particularly is interested in that. And because, when you think about Hong Kong, well, precisely because I no longer lived in Hong Kong now, even though I visit here every year, living apart from Hong Kong actually make me contemplate Hong Kong identity all the more, right? So, and it's something that I think about a lot. And from the really early days, like about 20-some years ago, I already feel we're dissatisfied with the notion or the discourse of hybridity of East and West. It's just not my experience as a Hong Konger going up here and got my degree through the Chinese University of Hong Kong in the Fine Arts Department. It's just not, I didn't feel that it's just simply just a hybrid of East and West. And for me, Hong Kong is something that is has a lot of fluidity to it. It's about the unknown. It's about the possibility. And so I think when I pick plastic, of course, it's the material itself. It's also the history of many industry in Hong Kong, but it's also the philosophical implication of it being fluid and in transition between states that I'm really interested in. And when as I do more research on plastic, I realize that it's not even material. It's a code. It's a formula. It's a chemical code to put natural molecules together. So I think that has to me, that is very Hong Kong to me. And yeah, maybe I'll just stop here because I can go on.
Yeah. Yeah, Stella, would you like to, or Samson?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think like it's me and Ying had many sort of conversations about this, and I think it's the kind of question that you like. Actually, if you think too much about it, it kind of paralyzes you, because then it becomes like that, like everything that you think about. And I think our approach was just that we trusted our instinct that because we live here, we are from here, then whatever issue and sort of, I mean, the show, specifically our show, was talking about issues and currents that were relevant to also many sort of people in other parts of the world. So whatever we are thinking about and the way that we are processing these information, if you are sort of trusting your instinct, of course you are bringing to it a unique perspective within which is also a specifically geographical perspective, but also other sort of perspective that are inherent in how I see myself as a person. So I think that's yeah. So sorry, a long answer to your question, but I think we were trying to actually not to over and underline it. However, although I have to say, of course, in a show like this, one cannot be naive also that, I mean, whatever you do is going to be read in that sort of context, because people are interested in those sort of perspective in this sort of situation in a show.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question. I do remember we also discussed with Tang Qinghua during the preparation time. I remember he's saying that, well, he lived and worked in Hong Kong, but on the other hand, he's also a world citizen in a way. And then he also reminded me about his history, because he actually born in mainland China and then moved to Hong Kong when he was 6. So that's the reason why he's very confused when he was young, because when he just moved to Hong Kong, and then by that time, a lot of people actually not, because it's, a lot of, like immigrants, from mainland, and then he feel uneasy about that time. But of course, after the 1997 handover, then suddenly, the whole, Hong Kong situation has changed. So he always feels struggling when people ask him, are you a Hong Kong artist? And he said, are you a Chinese artist? I'm not sure. So he's always like this. And, but I also, remember, we also have a conversation saying that, I think when we are referencing a lot of other national pavilions as well, especially in terms of, the contemporary art context, because contemporary art by itself is also always about questioning, and also is always in fluidity. So to my understanding, a lot of other pavilions, some of them are celebrating this kind of representation, national identity, but some are actually questioning about that, and also some actually rejecting this idea by, some, we remember, a few years ago, the German pavilion actually swapped, with French pavilion as well, in order to question and also address, like more discussion about what does it mean, by representing, the country, the place. So I think these are all very interesting questions that maybe we need to, put more thoughts in the future.
Young, yeah.
No, I was thinking. I mean, the
You,
sort
you.
of. I mean, the national representation model in Venice has been criticized so much anyway. But just to go back to what we're talking about, Hong Kong identity and all that. I don't think we talked that much about that. I can't be sure because I can't quite remember. But I don't think we did talk that much about it, because I think we, like Lars, Kit, and myself, I think we were quite sort of clear right from the beginning that it was about doing a good project. And I mean, the concept was really to present Lee Kit. And so I think we didn't talk about it because of the fact that, I mean, he's a Hong Kong artist. I mean, that's a given. So we didn't sort of think about it too much, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, just building upon what Stella has talked about and also what Shirley has talked about. I think for this edition, I think it's particularly interesting because I split my time between Hong Kong and Amsterdam, and Shirley's from Hong Kong but now lives in LA. So I think for me, and I think for Shirley, we share this feeling, is also how we try to problematize or even broaden this idea of where Hong Kong art happens, where Hong Kong art is being produced or circulated, how it relates in a global scale. I think that's something that Shirley's work really deals with a lot, thinking about the impact of globalization with her own identity, thinking through plastic, and it's also evident in this exhibition.
So I hope this is helpful when I just say that over the 4 editions, even though the first one I wasn't involved, I heard a lot about it, is that as the curating organization of the Hong Kong participation, our approach has always been not about what is Hong Kong art and who's the best Hong Kong artist in terms of representing this mythical art form that is Hong Kong, And I think what's, for me, great to see all of the 4 presentations is both breadth and depth and diversity and range. That's in Hong Kong art. And then here, Hong Kong just simply an indicator or designation of the location. But with Shirley's most recent participation, it's not even just a physical location anymore. It is an idea. It's a formula, was it? So in selecting artists, our approach has always been, as Jung said, that we commit to an artist that we believe in, and then present his or her practice as best as we can. Provide encouragement and resources and be the sounding board, and each edition selecting the artist who is at the right moment, which of course is not an exact science, but it is a very high pressure, high visibility environment. And for those people who are not so familiar with the Venice Biennale, it is an exhibition of dozens and dozens of exhibitions. There is the main exhibition, but there's at least 4 dozens of national participations. And on top of that, there are usually 20, 30 collateral exhibitions. There are literally 100 exhibitions going on at the same time, vying for attention. So the artist needs to be able to handle that pressure on top of producing works for an exhibition. So it's the level of maturity, but also we seriously consider, would this be a useful and helpful thing for the artist at this juncture of their career? because we want this to be a launching pad or at least a very significant stepping stone. So that's really what concerned us in selecting and organizing each exhibition, not the question of the identity of Hong Kong art or what does it mean to be a Hong Kong artist. And I think this is perhaps an interesting academic exercise, but that was not a priority. Well, actually, it was not a priority because we knew that that's not important, in fact.
Yeah, so that's a really good point to kind of bring out or underscore that there is a very specific context to the Venice Biennale, right, which sometimes gets referred to as the Olympics of the art world. And, you know, there's a certain kind of way that everything gets reduced down to, oh, well, this is the person from this place or this is the person from that place. And I think you are very right to point out that there is a breadth and variety in the 4 iterations here, at least, you know, if not beyond, you know, back to 2001 even. But I think one of the things that does stand out, you know, in the iterations, in the maybe the politics that's been set out in the collaboration with M+, with Hong Kong ADC, is that there is a kind of an effort to put forward younger or, you know, mid-level talent, and it's not about like, you know, anointing the kind of, you know, the confirmed stars, as it were, which does happen with some countries, and often those pavilions are the least interesting, you know, which are just, I mean, not naming names, but you know, but it does happen where sometimes it's just about, oh, well, this person is a very prominent artist, and let's just put them there. And whereas here it's really about kind of giving place to people who may not necessarily have that kind of recognition yet, but, you know, are maybe, you know, at a point where they could benefit from that. That said, I was wondering, in each of your presentations you talked about what you did do. And I was wondering if maybe you might kind of think a little speculatively about what you wish you had done. You know, what are some things that, I know surely you're looking forward to planning here, so, you know, maybe there's less for you to say, or I don't know if you want to give a sneak peek. But are there things that you wish you had done differently in Venice, you know, now that you have the benefit of hindsight? So.
No, actually, no. I think we did what we wanted to do. I don't. Yeah, I'm pretty. Yeah, I think. Actually, no. Actually, well, I mean, but I guess I have to give you an answer. So, I just could go back to what Dorian was talking about earlier. That the fact, I think. I mean, I don't know about Lars. I can't speak for him. But for me, actually, I didn't really push Kit that much in Venice. I have to say. I sort of let him be. That was my attitude at the time. Whereas Hong Kong, I did get much more involved, actually, the Hong Kong version. And the fact is, I think because just Venice just was quite stressful for artists, no matter what, I think, you know, for Lee Kit at least. And I really, and kind of stressful for me in the sense that I didn't want to be the person responsible for destroying his career. So I was like, you know, you do what you want to do in a way almost, you know. Whereas Hong Kong, because, I mean, he was quite well known in Hong Kong already at the time. So, you know, like, so we were sort of much more, in the sense, had more freedom actually to just sort of go for it. Sorry, I'm just passing on. I'm not forcing you.
I think we did everything that we wanted to do in Venice. Actually, I was pretty happy with it. But when the show was due to come back in Hong Kong, so at the end we sort of brought the show back to Hong Kong in pretty much the same way that it like in terms of the division of the works and the different pieces and how they flow. It was quite similar to Venice, but there was an early idea to do a 180 and turn the pavilion into a bumper car video arcade, which would have been fun, but we didn't do it.
I must say, well, Zhang Yihua is a very, very ambitious artist. So I think we already try our very best within budget to build everything that you want to build. I think just one minor thing, I think at the very beginning, when he also think about, you know, like covering the whole courtyard, I think ideally he really want not having too many walls, not having just a container, but really just cover, you know, the ceiling, so that we can leave the facade of the gallery, so you can still, you know, see traces, you know, of the historical, you know, like, you know, marks. But then, so really, you know, realizing the idea of turning the light time in the daytime into nighttime. But of course, at the end, just because of all the regulations, all the, you know, like restrictions of not touching, you know, the historical building like this. So that's the reason why there's no way that we can just do, you know, just, you know, make, you know, just cover the ceiling, but not having a standalone kind of, you know, container like space. I think this is the only one thing, but in general, I think we kind of, you know, being magician and then did, you know, the very best, you know, to kind of achieve, you know, what the artist, you know, you know, plan to do.
Well, it's still very fresh because the show is still up right now. So I think I'm really grateful for the resources provided by M+ and ADC. I think we did everything we had wanted to do there. So, and when I'm planning for the return show, I'm not thinking about things that I should have done, and then now I haven't. It's not how I think about it, but it's just a totally different site. So right now I'm thinking about how to respond to the specific site of the M+ pavilion here, rather than some things that I had wanted to do and didn't do. But I will say maybe not for the exhibition per se, but as the duration of the, I mean, Venice Biennale is a very specific venue. So I guess maybe it would be nice to have some public program done in Venice, in addition to doing it in Hong Kong. So that's the only thing that I can think of. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe at this point we can open up the floor for questions from the audience. It's awful dark, so I don't know. Maybe we can, yeah, okay. So does anyone have any questions? We have, I think, someone. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. There's a question in the back.
This is a question for Shirley and Christina. I haven't seen the show yet, but I'm interested in the process. You know, based on the photos, it looks like there are different kinds of wood. And can you talk us through the process of producing the works? Were some of these objects existing? You modify them. So if you can talk us through, like, how the fabrication process and the thought process.
Yeah, because there's the limitation of time, so I didn't get into talking about that, but I'm really happy to answer that question. So are you referring to both installation or that Right. Okay, so I'll start with negotiated differences, the installation in the indoor one. So all the spindle, the wood are carved with a machine by me and another assistant. So in another word, there is no, maybe there's no, actually we didn't use it. So there's no ready-made object in the indoor space at all. It's all handmade by, mediated through a machine. And as well as the joinery or the connector that's done by a 3D printer, that the digital file for the 3D printer actually download from the internet through open source. So that I see that as a sort of 21st century ready-made, but it exists in a digital form. So I just use a 3D printer to materialize that, so to speak. And in terms of the spindle, because the concept is to incorporate as many different kind of differences as possible. So I have sort of a mental checklist of what I want to carve. And I want to include abstraction and representation and also work that reference the process itself. So in some of this, a few of the spindle are actually a replica of the wooden handle of the chisel I used to make the work. Does that make sense? And so in that sense, we try to cover as many possible form and function as possible. And for the outdoor work, some of the sculpture that you've seen in the middle of the courtyard are previous work from my last solo show that I have developed a sculptural language that incorporate biomorphic form that's mounted on stand and tripod that could be telescopable. And that show focused on the idea of seeing and the position of seeing. And I thought for play court, it's interesting to reverse the position of the body and the object. So instead of the player as, the body as a player, then it become the net in the middle. And some of the object in play court are found object, like the racket, or I didn't make it, is bought and altered. And the shuttlecock, which title Shuttle Pod is fabricated by me using cast rubber and vanilla bean pot, and that has a significant to part of the idea of the colonial history of badminton, and that has to do with personal narrative of my family being part of a Chinese diaspora who have contributed to the workforce in rubber plantation in Malaysia, as well as vanilla beans plantation in Tahiti. So did I cover everything? Something like that. Do you want to?
Hi, it's a simple question, particularly for the chief curator. My only personal visit to the Venice was 2011, actually, before the M+ participation in the Hong Kong Pavilion. My impression was that actually the Biennale was dominated the city. So actually the visibility of art in Venice during the Biennale is very high. So do you think actually we can do something like this in Hong Kong, and would it be actually possible to have a very large scale of exhibition all around in different places in Hong Kong? Maybe after the M+ officially launched in the 2020.
I can answer that in a very quick way, which is probably not. I mean, and then I base that answer on our M+'s experience of what we used to call mobile M+ exhibitions before we had this small space called M+ Pavilion in West Kowloon. And it's a really challenging thing to just simply find spaces for exhibition in Hong Kong. So that will be just really the main hurdle, I would imagine. But at the same time, maybe to be a bit more serious, does a city like Hong Kong with a very quickly growing ecology of contemporary art need a biennale? We have increasing number of institutions, nonprofit organizations focused on contemporary art. There has been explosive growth of galleries that are bringing artists not only local from region but also internationally. In fact, I don't think we're suffering anymore from the dearth of contemporary art in the city. Of course, biennales do different things than museums or institutions or galleries, but I think Venice is a very unique situation. And then the Venice Biennale started in 1885, or something like that. So it's been 120 or 130 years old, and it had various reasons why it started, but one of the reasons is that the city has been dying, essentially. currently, the city, which was a very powerful republic with hundreds of thousands of people living back in the 13th century, currently has about just 50,000 people living there. Of course, it has millions of visitors every day, but the city itself does not have any industry other than tourism. But this is a situation that has been going on since the late 19th century, which is why the Biennale was introduced to revive the economy, but also create essentially an industry. And that's a very different situation than what Hong Kong is in terms of its population and of its vibrancy and being a very still active cosmopolitan center. So, that's the reason why, practical reasons, historical reasons, why perhaps it doesn't make sense to have a Biennale here. Well, if somebody wants to start a Biennale, I'm not going to stop them. But not me, I don't think.
Maybe something else to add to that is that, I've kind of been thinking about this particular conversation for a while, partly because I'm someone who also arrived in Hong Kong not so long ago, but in my previous incarnation in the United States, I was involved with an initiative called Pacific Standard Time, which is about, putting Los Angeles on the art world map. And that was like a multi-year, very kind of complicated and very laborious process, which involved multiple institutions being kind of well-funded in order to do that. And if there's someone who wants to do that in Hong Kong, they're welcome to do that. But I'm not sure that there necessarily is, but also I'm not sure it's actually necessary. I mean, I think for all the reasons that Dorian enunciated, but also because Hong Kong is already on the world map, partly because of what Hong Kong is now, but also partly because of our Basel Hong Kong, right? So that is a kind of event that does make many people come here for art, whether or not they necessarily see it beyond the confines of the convention center, that's another question, but it is a moment every year, actually, when many people anyway, are here for art, I guess, I would say.
So I'm going to take the microphone back to say that actually what John just brought up is a really interesting model. And of course, you were part of it, so it's funny that I'm actually describing it, but that it's the Getty Foundation, a very, very generous foundation funding many different kinds of museums and institutions, from a museum dedicated to cowboy art to encyclopedic museum, so that each institution can develop its own exhibition or project, the first iteration being really California, isn't it? So I think that is a really interesting model. I think that institutions of many different kinds can share a topic but have a very different interpretations. And again, because in the last few years and in the next coming few years, Hong Kong will suddenly have a lot more institutions than just 5 years ago. And I think it is a quite interesting moment that we are not competing with each other. We don't need to compete with each other, but we can be more connected with each other. So, of course, what can facilitate that is a very generous funder. Yes. So it's great that ADC is sitting in the room. but really, I think the sort of shared economy is something non-profit institutions are thinking about a lot, and we may be entering a phase in Hong Kong, even amongst the non-profit institutions, that we are unintentionally competing with each other because we're just trying to do our job, and these kinds of overlaps sometimes happen by accident. So I think it's a great model to have an initiative where institutions can come together and all contribute to a certain topic or discourse.
Any other questions? If not, we can adjourn and give thanks to everyone of the panelists here tonight, all stakeholders, and you and you and you and you. So Thank you all very much. And infinite nothing.